My name's Lee, my surname's Walters. Premesh Lalu describes himself as a research professor. He's written two books, The Deaths of Insa and more recently, Undoing Apartheid. On behalf of UWC and the CHR, Premesh holds the chair in Digital Humanities, where we have a focus on the ideas around culture and techniques, and that is TECHNICS. So Premesh is going to be doing a 15 to 20-minute talk, followed by Candice, who describes herself, am I pronouncing it correctly? A memorist with a practice in photography, as a writer, as an editor, as a curator, a scholar, archival researcher, and educator. I think I said that early on. Candice also serves as the manager of the new Archival Visions program at the CHR. So what we'll do is Premesh 15 to 20 minutes, immediately followed by Candice, and then we'll throw it to the audience for another 20 minutes or so.
Good morning, everyone. Really welcome and great to have you with us in the Atsiba lab. I want to start by saying that this enigmatic notion of the wake that is in the title of this exhibition has intrigued me over the past few weeks, ever since Tony and I had the earlier email conversation. Partly because the wake is something that signals the rituals that mark death. The wake is what you organize when someone dies. It's what you organize in the aftermath of someone's passing. But it's also something, the trace, the wave that is left behind as a ship passes. And so there's this double notion of the wake that I want to deploy in some sense in what I want to give you in a reading on the session that tries to link slavery technology into a more composite picture for our present. As Tony was saying, I think there's something about our contemporary moment, particularly its apocalyptic features, that require us to think again about what history of slavery we want to engage with and how we want to engage with that history. So the painting I have about that I've put up here is a painting by Francis Danby, an abolitionist painting. It's titled The Opening of the Sixth Seal, and provides a unique portal into the double bind of the wake of slavery, and might possess a repressed truth about the apocalyptic modernity we currently inhabit. It's a it's a darkening painting, so it's unfortunately not very visible, but if you want to look it up on your device, it's called The Opening of the Sixth Seal, and it's a painting by Francis Danby. Danby's painting places the story of slavery at the very center of the history of modernity, so as to better serve the appearance of a planetary apocalypse. In Undoing Apartheid, I've argued that Danby's painting leads us to an argument not only about empire and capitalism, but apartheid as such, especially that form of apartheid that we experience in the everyday in this country as petty apartheid, that has left the pervasive scar of race on the desire for post-apartheid freedom. I turn to Danby's 1828 painting, The Opening of the Sixth Seal, not only to specify what it reveals about the chaotic scene of divine judgment and outrage in the wake of slavery, but more importantly to ask why the end of slavery in 1834, like the end of apartheid in 1994, reveals something hitherto hidden about the relationship between race and technology. So a few words about this painting. Francis Danby completed The Opening of the Sixth Seal in 1828 to convey his abhorrence at the institution of slavery, a sentiment that was likely born out of disdain for the domination of Ireland by Britain. Danby, being Irish, had settled in Britain where this painting was completed. Conveyed on an expansive canvas, and I just want to give you a sense of the scale of this painting. So it's the painting right at the far end over there. Conveyed by an expansive canvas, the very large work that now hangs in the Irish National Gallery in Dublin draws on the Book of Resurrection, but with a judgment of damnation on the slave owners who are cast as fallen in the wake of the emancipation of the slave. So if you look very closely at this painting, you'll see the way in which the wreckage of slavery is presented in the downfall and demise of the slave owner and slave master classes. So Danby's painting uh, allows us to think about, um, sorry, give me 1 second. I've skipped a page because, yeah. So let me proceed to disclose up front the secret of Danby's painting. Filled with a sense of awe and confusion that the scale that of the work that it induces on first appearance, when I was at the museum, the gallery in 2019, a security guard who had been observing my befuddled reaction directed my gaze to a stitch running through the canvas. While on display at Rochdale, so this painting was in the possession of a man called John Watkins Brett, who toured the painting to New York, Maryland, Boston, London, before it ended up at Rochdale in Lancashire in 1843. And while on display in Rochdale, two visitors walked into the museum and proceeded to mutilate the canvas by cutting out the unshackled slave with arms outstretched at the center of the painting. Given the vast audiences that it attracted across the Atlantic world, John Watkins Brett called on Danby to restore the image by restitching the figure of the slave back into the painting. So what happened here is this painting drew considerable attention. In New York, throngs of people just gathered to go see this work, this apocalyptic work about what would follow the end of slavery. And in protest against this emancipatory potential of the painting, these two visitors, gentlemen they were called in the newspapers of the time, walked into the gallery and cut the slave out of the image. Danby then went and proceeded to restitch the slave back into the canvas. Now, I've argued that this restitching of the figure of the slave into the canvas metaphorically opens onto the industrialization of the world and to folding the entropy of the chaotic world that appeared with the end of slavery in 1834 in the Caribbean and the Cape into a new order of the science of empire. And so I want you to just stay with me here because this is a stretch of an argument. But two links are important to consider if we search for the truth of slavery's wake in this work of art. At one level, Danby's painting coincided with the revolution in physics associated with what was called the Cambridge Philosophical Breakfast Club, which included the likes of William Ewell, Charles Babbage, and John Herschel, the latter who arrived at the Cape in 1834 as slavery was being abolished to map the southern skies. So this neighborhood, literally two or three blocks from here, observatory, is where John Herschel built the first telescope to map the southern skies, and where he was visited by Darwin in that exchange that Ros Morris and Yvette Christians have given us this wonderful opera about this meeting of these two scientists, an evolutionary biologist and a physicist. So this Cambridge Philosophical Breakfast Club was an important movement, group of young graduates at Cambridge University who revolutionized not only the idea of the university, but what counted as knowledge. Through their collective redesigning of the project of knowledge that included the naming of the word scientist as a particular function distinct from artist in the structure of knowledge in 1833, this group of Cambridge scholars sought to create order out of the implication of chaos in Danby's painting by naming physics as the reigning discipline for reordering the world that would ensue with the end of slavery. Now, Marx would worry about this lending of the new form of science to the cause of industrialization in his well-known fragment on the machine in the Grundrisse, where he set out the outlines of his latest study of capital. So that's the first point I want to make, is that Danby's painting gives us a sense of the absolute sense of chaos that reigned in the moment of the prospects of the abolition of slavery. And that this painting is symptomatic of a real sense of anxiety in the metropole, particularly about what the world would look like in the wake of slavery. It is also in that moment that science steps up, the science of the university, to offer a way out of this chaos, to produce a new order, to produce the scientific mechanisms and methods of cause and effect to produce the conditions by which some stability can be produced in the prospect that chaos would reign in the aftermath of slavery. But at another level, the acquisition of the painting by Brett Watkins opened a second, more discrete truth about the painting. Watkins, it turns out, was not only an art collector and speculator in the art trade, he was also a telegraphic engineer and founder of the Atlantic Telegraphic Company. Rumor has it that while the painting was in his possession, he pondered the meaning of the lightning bolt running through the top right-hand panel of the painting as it cut through the macabre scene of indictment of the class of slave owners. In it, he found the inspiration to proceed to build a future-oriented vision of a telegraphic system that would link the continents. The nascent linking of the continents through the telegraphic revolution marks the birth of a system of modern communication that laid the telegraphic cable as a precursor to the Googlerization of the earth in the wake left by the cargo ships that sailed the Middle Passages. Communication laid bare new oceanic networks that would become the pathways for the making of empire. And for this, we need only consult Erich Hurl's wonderful book called Sacred Channels, which argues that modern communication was born in the 1830s, and I would add, in tandem with the so-called abolition of slavery. So let's summarize briefly. The aura of Danby's painting reveals the onset of two narrative folds in the story of modernity. The onset of the intertwined relations of capital and communication that not only establishes the boundless quest for empire, but also enfolds the burdens of slavery into a technological milieu that sustains both industrialization and speculative and extractive forms of capitalism. So the story of how science resulted in the proletarianization of labor, a story that Marx describes in the shift from slavery to wage slavery, is well known to us and marks the long 2 centuries long struggle against capital and empire. So this is the well-worn path of all the ways in which we think about resistance, not only in this country, but globally, in its anti-imperialist manifestations, that what you have is a process out of slavery that leads to the proletarianization of labor, and that the proletarianization of labor is what constitutes modern modes of capital and the drives behind modern modes of capital. But what is less known is the specter of slavery conveyed through the supplementary emergence of new forms of communication. Now here I want to pull out and draw out for you a little bit about what this means for thinking about the problem of apartheid, which I suspect in this country has largely been misapprehended. It has not been understood in its full, in the full extent of the force that it lays before us. Communication is the technological sphere that transforms the remains of slavery into speculations of race as a foundational fiction of colonialism and apartheid. Now, there are 2 modes through which this unfolds. So as this technological revolution is unfolding, the first with the revolution in thermodynamics that gives you the railways that leads to the colonization of vast expanses of the earth, what you also find is the development of a science in the university that tries to apply the rules of physics to the human. And that science of applying the laws of physics to the human became known as psychophysics. Later, psychotechnics, a discipline that attempted to measure sensory responses to external stimuli. In other words, if we were to put a message before you, trick you into believing through an advertisement to feel something for an object, would we be able to shift the perceptual field towards that object? Now, this sounds like a bizarre, small, failed science, but in fact, its repercussions were quite significant. And founded in the laboratories in Leipzig by Wilhelm Wundt, a form of experimental psychology, it is the place that became the model for what got built at Stellenbosch University in the early 1900s, that became the place where the young Hendrik Verwoerd did his PhD dissertation. This Hendrik Verwoerd would later become the so-called architect of apartheid. I've suggested that he's more a lab technician than he was an architect, but that's another story. But Verwoerd did his training in this lab where the measurement of sense perception became the basis of working out how to resolve the poor white and the native questions in South Africa. The beginnings of the first racial order is being constituted in relation to this discipline in the early 1900s that came out of thermodynamics, but that sought to apply those rules of entropy and negentropy to the human. And so there's a recasting, a remaking of the category of race in the 1900s that would lay the foundations for a modern form of race that is transpiring not only in South Africa, but also the US. That's what connects the US to South Africa, is the discipline of psychophysics. Just a footnote, wonderful book by Erica Fretwell called Sensory Experiments about how this is unfolding in parallel in the US in that same period. So this is the one form of communication that produces another version of proletarianization, which I'm going to call the proletarianization of the senses. So what Marx anticipated was the proletarianization of labor. I'm saying what he could not see through this development of communication and communication technologies was a proletarianization of the sensory world. And so what you have by the early 1900s is a reconfiguration of the meaning of the idea of race to supplement what is labor with a sensory order. And that sensory order, if you remember, is also the name of the book that Friedrich Hayek, that great architect of neoliberalism, would produce as a book, as a text in 1952. So you can see where my argument is leading to here, that slavery is being enfolded again and again into the emergent technological milieu, first in thermodynamics, then in psychophysics. But more recently, in 1948, as the world was becoming partitioned, Israel, Palestine, in South Africa, apartheid, India, Pakistan, in the ways in which that partition became a solution to the catastrophes of the Second World War, you have a third iteration of this technological revolution in communication called cybernetics. Norbert Wiener at MIT produces the mathematical basis for a science of communication and control that would become flipped into the idea of apartheid, so that apartheid comes to stand in for a way of governing populations through processes of communication and control. And what you have is a division of apartheid into two formulations. Grand apartheid, it's strategic kind of legal apparatus, but an apartheid of the everyday called petty apartheid. And that petty apartheid takes the assault of the senses into a control of populations that allows the state and its various instruments to control populations in the everyday. In other words, to create the condition and threat of civil war in the everyday. So how this works is you create a threat of civil war in the everyday, and then grand apartheid descends and creates peace amongst the warring parts. And so what you have is this mechanism that is being established that plays out in the ways in which communication is being folded into a new modernity, a new version, new script of modernity, but where the figure of the slave is being tracked into that condition. I want to call that the proletarianization of knowledge. And that proletarianization of knowledge is now symptomatic of why we find ourselves in a repetition compulsion. That what was marked as the abolition of slavery in 1834 forced us to think again in 1994 about the end of apartheid. There's a repetition in that, a failure for marking out the rhyme of hope and history in that moment. So 1834 fails to rhyme with 1994. And we're back in a moment of trying to dislodge this configuration of race that has come to take hold in this moment. And so I want to suggest that we have, in this unfolding of the technological milieu, a way of reading Danby's painting as a symptom of an unfolding of a category of race, what Stuart Hall would call a slippery signifier, or an unreliable, unstable signifier. That what you have here is a way in which the figure of the slave, restitched into the canvas, appears not only at the point of production in the factory that Marx anticipated, but also in the modes of communication and the speculative realms of communication and control. So let me, 2 minutes. So apartheid, like slavery before, cannot simply be transcended. It has to be undone by attending to the slippery signification that race lends to the apocalyptic feeling that seems to have become a feature of our modern neurosis. And the question that we have to ask, and I'm going to suggest that this might be one way of proceeding with the discussion here, is how do we wish to think the question of the slave being restitched into this canvas of modernity as a way to think about the contemporary conjuncture? That what we're not dealing with here is a simple matter of constituting the terrain of resistance. And I'm sorry to say this, I know I'm spoiling everyone's morning here. But to think again about what an analytics of apartheid might produce when you trace it through this technological milieu that will allow us to come to terms with what is being produced as the catastrophe of the senses in the Middle East, but also the rise of this terrifying specter of AI, which has really been passed on to us through the cybernetic revolution in the third iteration of the communication revolution. And in both of those subsequent developments on the emergence of capital in the 19th century, psychophysics and cybernetics, we have a dangerous, dangerous poison chalice before us. We have a situation where race is being conscripted to those logics and rationalities to produce new catastrophes and new apocalyptic sensibilities from which we need to think our way out of.
So I have a much more humble offering this morning. And disclaimer, what I'm going to be reading describes violence, pain. I don't often read it, but when asked to participate today, I thought to return to this image, which I've been really returning to since 2015, when I first encountered it and started to fold it into my practice. So I'm going to read a kind of poetic documentary verse, which is about this image, and I was asked to write about David Goldblatt a few years ago. The Yale University Art Institute of Chicago was doing a first retrospective of him post his death. And I, had to come to terms with the reality of David Goldblatt, who is really important to thinking about South Africa. We cannot think South Africa visually without him. And I've had to come to terms with his apartheid history, having worked for Anglo-American, and yet being the founder of the Market Photo Workshop in 1986. And so this piece is called A Visible Unseen, and it responds to this image, which its caption reads as follows. On an afternoon in summer, the farm Kwaggasfontein in the Great Karoo. About 200 years ago, after 13 years of work, 2 slaves are said to have completed the building of this wall, which surrounds the farmyard, near Graafrenet, December 1966. From out of the shadows, under the shade of trees, to the distance beyond, where a dark hill poured underneath a mountain of light that didn't shine, he photographed the catastrophe. At his feet, a darkness risen like ghosts gathered to haunt this place, whose name marked the disaster. A windmill nearby, a pursuit of the wind, a gravestone for the many on a land that kept its mystery against the wall of his dispassion. For looking not to see a master's monument, known yet unrecognized, unfeeling, vanished and alive, gone but here, sentenced, unspoken, near and untouched, photographed, unseen. Against ambiguous architectures for the blackout doors, they watch cloudless heavens, unburdened of a land with no ground for existence, with no walls to keep. It was 1966 when he photographed unseen visibilities 200 years ago that he told as 2 slaves and 13 years of work. By 1766, Monica van Bengalen's eyes had stopped running over horizons. Her beloved Rainier from Madagascar was not coming back after Matthias Kriegel's wife did not drink tea but wine. That day, his wife undressed their daughter, spanned her into a known hold, and familiar cries before the girl found breath with animals in the kraal. Rainier had begged to Monica, to them, to sell his daughter, begged for the girl to beg and ask to be forgiven for no cause. Life there would have meant the death of her. It meant the death of them when Rainier took a knife to his master and then fled. And that day came only decades later, after Rainier was sentenced to the island for living alone and free in the mountains for 20 years. By 1966, Robert Sobukwe, a son of Grafrenet, served their time on the island under a law created to detain him without end. In the year when Some Afrikaners Photographed was published, Sobukwe's mother died, waiting for her son, who would be laid to rest 3 years later in Grafrenet, near where David Stierman, another native son, labored on a farm before leading rebellion, then twice escaping the island before being banished in 1823 to Australia, never to return again, neither dead nor alive, to a land waiting unreturned almost 4 centuries on. This farm, he told, had a name, Kwaggasfontein, where the presence of zebra mules once flowed like waters. Named after the sound it made, the last syllable very much prolonged, the kwagga, by 1878, was hunted into extinction. The last one in captivity died in Amsterdam 5 years later. Only one is believed to have ever been photographed alive. Said Lord Randolph Churchill about a kwagga in Men, Minds and Animals in South Africa, 1822. The place seemed alive with game. I came up to Lee, who had again dropped another antelope. I saw a kwagga, fired at him, and dropped him just a little beyond Lee's wounded antelope. We walked on towards the antelope and kwagga, Lee giving them each a finishing bullet. We then remounted and galloped on. Lee shot another antelope and wounded it severely. I fired at and broke the hind leg of a kwagga. We traversed the place where we had chased the antelopes and found that the antelope to which Lee had given the finishing bullet had got up and made off. The kwagga was there, dead enough, lying on his stomach, with his foreleg doubled under him, with a neck arched and striped skin looking a lovely object. Could he tell? Was he inside, outside, in the dark, shedding light, within, withheld, embraced by who he cannot without? But that was another day in 1966, somewhere between the image and the frame, when the last of the latter-day landlords sat for him like a dreadful schoolboy, posed against photographs that faced elsewhere, on either side of a small mournful figure that appeared as if a shadow thrown against the wall and him. Thank you.
The idea of the catastrophe of the senses, that kind of really jumped out at me. And it as a planetary condition for human and beyond human beings. How might we think about that? I was also thinking, how might we, in the post-apartheid, kind of rebuild our senses in a way that kind of opens ourselves to what or to which often goes unseen in relation to what Candice had to say, or unheard, as we might hear later on as well. And then I thought maybe the last comment I'll make before throwing it out there is, how might we reignite our sense of rebellion, you know, in a way that kind of makes us jiggle and wiggle and jigger, you know.
I had the privilege this term semester to be in Professor Patricia Hayes' visual history course. And through that was introduced to the work of Zainab Gershel. I don't know if I'm saying that correctly, who has this idea of looking together as method. And at first I was like, oh, this is like a kumbaya kind of gesture. But no, I think it has given me language to understand in writing this piece, which was also part of our course curriculum, that there's a way that I think this history of slavery, colonialism, we don't talk about genocide, but it's also enfolded into all of that, how these histories compel us to look together and start to weave across geographies, times. In that sense, they offer us that possibility. And I thought to share a quote about looking together, which I have found really useful. Looking together means holding on to specific details in certain photographs, because these details hold together layered histories that move between what she's writing about the Ottoman Empire, Europe, and the United States. And also because the details allow us to hold on to individuals even when they were speaking of populations and mass migrations. Though photographs freeze a single moment in time, looking together requires observing from the perspective of many points in time to search out not only what photographs show, but also what they cannot yet show or can no longer show. Looking together means looking at photographs anew each time new information is learned. And I find this quote really important and compelling for me in trying to articulate the way that this looking together is not just about history and time, but it's also a sensory question. So we're not just looking together, but we're feeling, we're listening, we're being together. And I think, yeah, that's something I thought to offer from your prompt.
Great stuff.
Yeah. So very briefly, I come out of a student movement in 1985, and one of the slogans we produced, Sarita is here, she will know this, is we thought the state was on its knees. So we blustered on about the state being on its knees, and it ended in a tragedy, in a massacre called the Trojan Horse Massacre. And it stayed with me for a very long time, from 1985 to the present, is firstly the name given to that massacre, the Trojan horse, the work of deception, the art of war, the act of willful forgetting that leads to civil war. And I've been worried that in this country, the willful forgetting about how that moment of rebellion has led to a greater set of dangers, partly because we refused to apprehend the problem that we were opposing. And there were teachers amongst us who said, be careful, you've stumbled on something that the generation of the 60s did not see. Richard Reeve being one of them in a novel called Emergency Continued. But if you don't study this problem, you're going to find yourself in a difficult situation further down the line. We are living through that misapprehension of the problem of apartheid, I believe, in the current moment, in the streets. That rebellion, firstly, is always assigned to a category marked by apartheid's, those who receive the raw end of the kind of apartheid stick. So our students are rebelling at the moment, disrupting exams. And in the normative spaces of South Africa, people will continue their education. And there will be a marked difference in the kind of outcomes racially in this society. So I want us to think very carefully about what we do with this question of education. It disappeared from our vocabulary. You can be at a university and no one talks about education, not even what it means, how you conduct it, what its implications are. And so I'm suggesting here, if we pay attention, if we attend to this problem of apartheid in a way that asks what we did not see, to use Candice's formulation, in the problem of apartheid, we might understand what is globally being constituted as a convergence of capital and these new technologies of communication. Because I think what's happened here is that these two strands of the 19th century are now converging. Capital on the one hand and communication. And that combination is leading to very, very dangerous and aberrant kind of effects, consequences. I think we only now going to realize what the consequences of AI is going to look like for the proliferation of warfare as we're seeing in the Middle East. And so I'm saying, apartheid was part of that sequence of modernity. And I want to locate it. I have no desire to hold on to apartheid as a South African problem. In fact, I think it was global, as Moritz and others have put it, to begin with. It's a form of biopolitics that was germinated here by an accident of history, but has its parallels in the US. And it's the US and South Africa that need to think about what we've deposited in our modernity out of our experience as the problem of race and its aftermaths.
What's interesting to me in the Danby painting and in the photograph is the evocation of what should be there but you can't hear, right? It's more obvious in some ways in the Danby painting. I mean, you'd imagine that scene would have, there'd be a cry of some sort, to put a small eye on it. But in the photograph of the farm in the Karoo, I mean, there is a silence in the Karoo that the photograph kind of conveys, and yet the caption, again, imputes a kind of cry, a scream to the photograph. So I'm wondering how that work of sound in both images would kind of percolate into what you're presenting. And it became really apparent to me when Candice was giving her presentation, and the lyricism with which you were articulating your reading kind of made me think, whoa, it almost stabbed me the way that a needle would stab a finger. And this is where I come to stitching, right? Because the stitching that's required for the repair of a painting is an old form of working with the hand. It's not the stitching of industrial labor. Yeah. And so there is something about that which then, in my mind, immediately runs into how we're trying to re-articulate the connection between the mind and the hand in the center. So throw that on the table for you guys to play with.
I was just intrigued about how you chose that painting, use that painting as a trope to talk about so much, and it's brilliant. So just, how and why you chose Danby's painting. And my second question, like Morris, I'm just kind of trying to make sense of it, is as someone who has started working with the sort of immersive technologies, and I think we all are increasingly kind of being pushed into this direction of there's increasingly more and more AI, and more is going to be done, and using that kind of artificial intelligence, where people are losing their jobs, and and you talk about the slave being restitched into the technical milieu, like the question of AI in the present. And I know you spoke a bit about warfare, but in also the race and techniques, like what is the kind of position that we need to take now in not just understanding but beyond understanding, especially coming from the continent, right? Um, yeah, it would just be to grapple with this idea of being from the continent, and knowing how AI is proceeding, and this kind of idea of race and techniques. Like, what is it that one can do right now?
I'm thinking about a claim that you make, Premesh, which is to say, apartheid cannot be transcended, it has to be undone, right? And that undoing process necessarily requires this studying of particular historical moments. And I suppose by leading with the fact that I'm a simple village fool, I'm also recognizing that apartheid has different implications in different spaces. It has a different touch in the rural outback of the Eastern Cape, as you very well know, Pramesh, similarly in the rural outback of KwaZulu-Natal. And I'm very familiar with these two spaces, so I suppose it's a selfish question, right, to say, in undoing apartheid, as opposed to transcending it, how do we take account of geography and the function of apartheid in its geographic touch, right? There's certain ways that it organizes peri-urban spaces, the urban space, versus to how it organizes rurality, right? Which becomes the Transkei, the Ciskei, KwaZulu, Babotswana, etc. Right? There are certain ways that it touches those spaces. And I'm curious about what it is that we learn from a geographical accounting in this undoing process. Yeah.
Silence is not really part of my vocabulary per se. I following like a Tina Kempt or a Kevin Kwashi. Um, when it comes to silence, I'm more in the world of quiet. As a frequency, and but you're right. In my exposition, I am trying to sound something out, but I don't think it translates to audibility even. Not that it can't be heard, but it's a yeah. I don't know if I have the word for it, but yes, I like the question around the sonic dimension of that. And I think, again, tying it back to Goldblatt and the captioning as a one means to be heard is kind of a signature form that he works in. The Goldblatt caption is in and of itself has its own kind of monumentality. So yeah, I actually haven't thought about his captioning kind of in the register of the sonic in the way that he's working. So thank you for that. Yeah.
Moritz, you might have picked up the difference in tone between my presentation and Candice, which was the difference between the apocalyptic and the lyrical. So, there's something to be said about, the modes of object and critique that we engaged in. But let me just put it, it requires a lot more thinking here. But I think there's something about the pastoral and the apocalyptic that needs to be tied together. I think the dispersal of the object of critique in our contemporary world Tony was referencing earlier, the way in which slavery has become more and more localized and regionalized in its objectification and as is problematization. But I think there's a need for us to rescript the, I mean, this sounds mad, to rewrite the order of things, basically, Foucault's order of things. Foucault's order of things begins with Las Meninas, Velázquez's painting. It's about self-reflection. I'm suggesting that this painting might serve us better in the midst of the kind of noise of the contemporary moment. So we say facing the same apocalyptic sensibility that Danby and company would have been facing at the end of slavery. That's the repetition that I'm calling attention to, right? So I think there's a movement between, a flipping between the pastoral and the apocalyptic that is rewriting the text of biopolitics and the way in which certain kinds of anxieties and oppressive conditions are being constituted in our present. So I think there's a lot about, what you're drawing out in relation to the stitch that we might want to think with here. What is going on in the stitch? What does the return of the slave to the canvas mean for us now? But I do want to say that it is impossible to think the question of modernity in its apocalyptic guise without the figure of the slave. That's the point I'm making. That we should charge ourselves with a greater task and not simply account for the history of slavery, but make slavery indispensable to the story of our modernity. And the way to do that is to situate the slave, the figure of the slave, in the unfolding rationalities of the technological milieu of capital. And unless we do that, we do ourselves a disservice by always being the kind of recipients of power. So I'm saying that we need to recast this narrative of modernity, which brings me to Meghna's question about how I came to this painting. I stumbled upon it in the Irish. I was, in the throes of despair, overworked by the Center for Humanities Research. A friend invited me to Ireland to spend 3 months at Trinity. I discovered Seamus Heaney and the Cure at Troy and realized that the Cure at Troy had been written for Mandela, the Sophoclean tragedy. And the last day I went to the gallery and I stumbled on this painting. And it's the security guard who alerted me. I had just been standing there thinking, what the hell is this? But he alerted me to the stitch. And I realized at that point that this painting was doing a lot more work for me in trying to put together another way of thinking about the problem of apartheid. That apartheid had been constituted as an object of critique through Marxism, nationalism, any number of critical formations in this country, but globally, as a problem of mere segregation. But that actually what it was reflecting, to use that term that Foucault uses, another dimension of the script of modernity. Just one small point, the thing about surprise is that the revolution in physics is based on this thing, I couldn't go into all of this, consilience of induction. So what they do is a consilience of induction is a surprise. When knowledge jumps from one field to another, when physics becomes the model for evolutionary biology. That's why Darwin and Herschel, when they meet here, Darwin is fascinated by the rules of physics and applied to the natural order. Otherwise, you can't observe evolution. So the painting, in some sense, was an inaugural moment of that surprise of knowledge jumping from one field to the other. And the position we need to be taking now is, you see, I've been arguing against the rush to ground in the center. Many colleagues here will tell you, rush to ground on where we stand on things. But I think that was the mode in the 1980s by which we opposed apartheid. And I think it was insufficient. I don't think we constituted any amount of structural change in the condition of apartheid. So 6 months of us madly running around fighting the apartheid state in 85, giving up our education, as Lee and others will tell you. And when I look back and I think, okay, so what structural change did you effect? And I soberly have to say, as I said at Alexander Sinton the other day, I think very little. So the question here is whether there's another kind of work that is required. And I'm calling that work an aesthetic education. An education that begins to think about how to reconstitute the relation of the senses as they've been partitioned, to use Jacques Rancier's formulation, as they've been partitioned and designated as models for control of populations and ideas of freedom.